Welcome to the Middle Ages, a period that lasted from the 5th to the 15th century where there are whole legends about the traditions of the wedding night. They paid much more attention to this night than the wedding celebration itself. After all, the moment of the first intimacy was long awaited not only for the newlyweds themselves, but also for their relatives and guests. The wedding traditions of the Middle Ages were a real torture for a newlywed couple. Marriage in medieval Europe was recognized as having taken place only if the young had sexual intercourse. Sometimes this action replaced reclining. The courtiers stood at the bed, and the young lay down dressed together and got up a few minutes later. All of them are husband and wife because they have been in the same bed. Welcome to History Rediscovered. In this episode, we discuss what actually happened on the wedding night in the Middle Ages. What took place the night of the wedding? There were no, and they lived happily ever after, fairy stories throughout the Middle Ages because, as we all know, it was a tough time for relationships in general. Contrarily, since love was less important than other factors, most marriages were forced and frequently decided by parents while their children were still in the womb. The primary purpose of nuptial connections during this time was to expand the family's possessions, lands, and power. It was akin to an alliance or barter agreement where the lady served as the best negotiating tool. With this in mind, during the 9th and 10th centuries, it became customary for nobles and kings to seek out wives from advantageous families or with other advantages, with very young women getting married to aristocratic knights who were already in their advanced years. The legal process was divided into two steps. First, a legal agreement was made between the father and the woman's future husband. The father would receive the woman's hand without the woman's permission, and the future husband would receive a dowry, a payment in kind that could include money, property, slaves, and labor, in exchange for the woman's hand. This was established in a legal document known as the Letters of Arras, and was known as betrothal. Following the signing of the contract, the future wife would live with her father until she became 18, which was 12 for common women and 15 for royalty. The well-known wedding ceremony would be observed on that day, officiating endless banquets and parties with food and drink to mark the changeover of the patria protested, and the lady would move into the home of the newlywed. The final and most crucial part of this pact would be completed once night fell, in the moonlight, making it nearly difficult to forget. The bedding ceremony. The term bedding ceremony refers to the wedding tradition of joining the newlyweds in bed in front of numerous witnesses, who are typically family, friends, and neighbors, to officially seal the marriage. The ritual's goal was to physically observe the couple's first sexual encounter, more metaphorically, to leave before consummation in order to certify the marriage's consummation. It stood for the community's support of the union. The degree to which the ceremony was legally binding changed significantly throughout time and place. The wedding night was very different from what you would imagine today, because it was not exactly a moment of pure passion. The newlyweds, who were barely 18 years of age, had to have intimate relations in front of several twisted pairs of eyes of notaries, priests, and servants who would certify the union between the two and confirm both the man's ability in bed, as well as the woman's chastity. Since it would be difficult for two strangers to perform the act in this circumstance, the witnesses occasionally gave them some privacy by drawing the curtains, or even chose to ignore what happened that night and gave the husband a perfect virility rating in an effort to prevent the marriage from being declared null and void due to impotence. It was usual for the husband to give the wife an ostentatious present the following morning in appreciation for having given him her purity after such a difficult night. About hygiene, for example, Marie de Medici was simply shocked by the fact that her husband, by the way, the King of France, did not even think about washing before their wedding night. In her homeland, ladies before such an event not only took a bath but also rubbed themselves with aromatic oils. Somewhere, the issue of cleanliness was treated superficially, without sharpening. Even real intimacy without prying eyes could not happen. There were relatives in the bedroom. If necessary, they could help with advice and pour wine on the groom, as they say, for courage. So, in England, even, the archbishop was invited to the lodge of the spouses. Until the 17th century, a sheet with traces of blood, a consequence of the wedding night, was hung out for general viewing, so, they say, the bride was a virgin. And this also did not bypass the kings. The dangers of pregnancy in the Middle Ages. The majority of women would agree that being pregnant is a bittersweet combination of feelings and peculiar sensations, mostly uncomfortable due to the nausea, pain, and hormonal changes that a living being developing inside you causes. However, unless there are additional complications, the risk to mothers' lives today is significantly lower than it was in the ancient Middle Ages. It must be kept in mind that throughout this time, mysticism and the influence of the Church obscured science. The ways to determine a woman's pregnancy and the timing of delivery were undoubtedly just pure beliefs with little to no support. Darkening of the eyes, somewhat scarlet urine, or garlic beneath the pillow that would or would not have flavor the next day might all be signs that a new life was developing. It was all about home treatments and potions to get pregnant or avoid difficulties, such lying down after performing an act or applying a mixture of peppermint, spikenard, mastic, and incense in oil on the stomach. Due to the severe discrimination against women that prevailed at the time, people held beliefs that pregnancy and delivery would be much easier for a boy and that it would even be possible to give birth in advance if the baby was a boy. The Church, on the other hand, did nothing but complicate matters around conception and delivery, since it believed that since procreation and childbirth originated in an act of desire, both mother and child could enter hell at any time throughout pregnancy and childbirth. They forced their own procedures on you to follow if you didn't want to be buried outside the cemetery and sent to the fires of hell if something went wrong, which just added to the suffering of expectant moms. And when things went wrong, just half of the babies made it through birth. It was typical for their mother to pass away during the process, so even if they managed to survive, they might lose her. This was all due to the clearly unequal circumstances in which they were giving birth, depending on social class. If the moment came while the mother was working or performing her chores, the commoners would be born on a pile of straw or even on the ground, while the aristocrats were welcomed with lovely white sheets and baths with essences. In ideal situations, the mother would give birth on a bed with statues of the Virgin Mary surrounding it for protection, helped by a midwife who was between 45 and 50 years old, of Christian faith of course, and preferably a mother, as well as a helper. They would handle everything, even if it meant performing a cesarean section, which greatly raised the likelihood of mortality. Truth or false? Wealthy nobles could choose any woman on their wedding night. It isn't difficult to believe in the existence of a law allowing the men of the high royalty to choose any woman under their dominion to marry without any resistance or reproach, something like a tax on the wedding that had to be paid with the purity of the future wife, given the historical context experienced during the Middle Ages. The feudal lord would demand the newlywed's chastity on her wedding night in accordance with what is known as the us primae noctis, or rite of pranata, in English. But despite the times and the overwhelming proof of numerous acts of violence against women, this practice continued.